Hello again, I'm Jim Deacon for the St. Joseph Evangelization Network, and we're here reporting live from the 74th Annual Serra International Convention in St. Louis, Missouri, the Rome of the West, as it's been called, and we've been talking back and forth with a number of the presenters and exhibitors, as well as the attendees here at the convention. The sounds you hear behind us are the sounds of an enthusiastic crowd receiving the awards luncheon here at the convention, and we're having a conversation with the Most Reverend Andrew Cozzens, Auxiliary Bishop of the Diocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Your Excellency, welcome to St. Joseph Network.
Thanks, it's great to be with you.
You know, the whole focus of the Serra International and this particular convention is we've been talking all about vocations, you know, throughout the course of the program. And I guess a good place to start in your own diocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, how would you describe the vocation situation there?
You know, actually, we've been blessed for many years in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis to have a number of vocations. So right now we have around 60 seminarians, and we ordained 8 priests this year. Next year we'll ordain 11. Almost all of those are homegrown vocations from the Archdiocese. So we've been blessed over a number of years. You know, in the last 10 years we've ordained 80 new priests. We're actually just beginning to turn the corner. I think, you know, statistically, you know, in the next 10 years, we'll probably retire about 55 priests. We have 55 priests who are 60 and older. But if we stay on track, what we've been doing, then we'll actually start growing the number of vocations in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, instead of shrinking them, which is really good news.
Well, and that really is counter trend. We hear so much about the shortage of priests and the dearth of vocations. Go ahead.
It's interesting, you know, because anyone who knows about the history of the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis knows the past couple of years have been difficult for us. The legislature lifted the statute of limitations, and so we declared bankruptcy because of lawsuits that came from past abuse of priests. But even in this period, for example, we had our largest discernment weekend retreat this last year that we ever had. We had 35 young men who came to a weekend retreat with the bishop to say they're interested in thinking about priesthood. So it just really shows that even in difficult times, God still calls people, and people can still respond.
And actually, we're not just in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, but in a number of other dioceses, we're seeing what could be called a mushrooming of response and interest in vocations. Yes?
It's true. You know, there are signs of hope everywhere. Of course, statistically, you know, we're still behind, but the important thing to recognize is that there are signs of hope, and that even in the midst of a culture where you would think that, you know, a young person in our culture would be looked upon as crazy for pursuing a vocation, and even sometimes not supported by their families, still, in fact, young people do respond.
It's interesting, too. From your perspective, to what would you attribute that tremendous response?
Well, you know, the response of a vocation in a young person, it starts with a very simple truth, and the simple truth is, I come to know who Jesus Christ is as a person, and that he knows me. And then gradually I begin to see that the plan that our world has for my own happiness and for my life will never make me happy. The world itself makes promises that it can't deliver. And when I discover that, and I discover that Jesus knows me and loves me, well, then I begin to ask him, what's his plan for my life? And as soon as I begin to ask that question, if I ask it seriously, Jesus will speak. And the truth is that young people are attracted to this truth that God has a plan for my life, and that his plan involves really the gift of myself. So, you know, for a long time in the church, I think we thought, well, if we somehow make the vocation to priesthood and religious life more attractive in terms of worldly things, you know, look at all the advantages that you could have, whatever it might be, then we would advance vocations, when it's actually opposite is the truth. In fact, the more that the vocation is attractive only because I'm giving my life for God and for nothing else, the more young people are actually attracted to it. I remember St. John Paul II, in his book Crossing the Threshold of Hope, he said youth ministry is in some way the most important work of the church, because it's while people are young that they discern their vocation. And that's the most important choice any person ever makes. And so we need to make sure that our young people come to know who Jesus is, and that he knows them, and that he loves them, and that he has a plan for their life, and then he'll take care of the rest. They're actually ready to give up everything to follow him if we'll make that invitation to them in a real way. Of course, you have to teach them how to pray. You have to help them to see the truth of who Jesus is, but if you do that, young people will respond. It's my experience.
And there's an excitement there, just like the excitement we're hearing around us as people are visiting the various exhibits and so on here at the convention. Now, if it's all right, Your Excellency, I'd like to get personal for a minute. You know, God's call to us as individuals to our state in life is as unique as each individual soul. Looking back at your own experience, when did you first realize that you were being called?
You know, I had a unique experience like everybody does, but my family was very involved in the church as a child, so, you know, I remember going on Saturday mornings to help clean the church and just being around the church. And actually, when I was in first grade, my parish priest, Monsignor Barry, for some unknown reason, picked me out of all the other first graders and had me make my first communion early. And it was turned out because he found out he was leaving the parish, and he wanted me to serve Mass for him. And so in order to do that, I had to make my first communion. So I made my first communion a year ahead of my classmates, and then I started serving Mass for him. And I immediately fell in love with the Mass, and I sensed Jesus' presence in the Eucharist even as a young boy, and I just wanted to be close to Jesus. So it wasn't long after that I told my parents, I think I want to be a priest like Monsignor, you know. And that idea was always in the back of my head. So even when I went to high school and I realized it wasn't cool to talk about priesthood, and it certainly didn't help me get dates, so I didn't talk about it. If you knew me well enough, I would have said, well, I'm actually thinking about being a priest. I just always had this idea in my head, I think because my parents taught me. They said, you know, God made you, and God has a plan for your life, and your job is to figure out what that plan is. And so I always had the idea in the back of my head that the plan was for priesthood. But it wasn't really until I was in college when I met other young people who had a real living relationship with Jesus, who prayed every day, who went to adoration, who went to confession regularly, and I started to do those things with them. That's when I started to realize that I could say yes to this vocation that had always been there. And, you know, thankfully I went to a small Catholic college in Kansas, Benedictine College, and from my time there are 15 priests who came out of that small college. We were about 650 students, you know. But we knew each other, and we supported each other, and we prayed together, and a lot of us ended up with vocation. So it was a great gift.
That's amazing. That's really neat. You mentioned, as you went through the chronology, you mentioned how important it was to develop that love of the Mass from serving Mass.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, there's a linkage, or at least traditionally there has been, between individuals who serve Mass and those who go on. We don't hear so much about that anymore.
Yeah, I think though you do see it in certain parishes where the being a Mass server is held up as something that's really valuable to do. I think you do see that, especially young men, begin to develop an identity with Jesus in the Mass, you know, and want to be close to him. And I've also seen women's religious vocations come just from the fact of going to daily Mass, you know. In fact, it's one of the things I tell college students when they go to college. I say, go to daily Mass a few times at least, because that's where you're going to meet your best friends at the college you go to. And I usually also say join the pro-life group, because that's also where you meet really good Catholics who will be a support to you as you're trying to grow in your faith in college. Those times we know are so important for our young people to develop their own relationship with God so that they can discern their vocation.
Now, we talked about the enthusiastic response, the growing response on the part of young people to the call. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, is it fair to say that the young people today are facing obstacles to answering that call that maybe are new or at least strengthened? No,
it's certainly true that there are, in certain ways, more obstacles in our world today. The first thing, of course, is just a young person's upbringing. If a young person doesn't come from a solid family where they grew up in the faith, then it can become more difficult to say yes to their vocation, because a vocation is a sacrificial kind of life, and so young people need to learn when they're young that it's actually in giving that you are most happy. And so that can be difficult for young people. All of us, who go into formation in seminary or in religious life have to deal with a certain amount of baggage from our past if we're going to be able to respond to that vocation. And today's culture, because of the way the culture is, does increase that baggage. I often tell young people today, I'll say, if you go to college and you just do what everybody else is doing, then in the first 6 months of college, it's going to take you 10 years to heal your soul from all the damage that you will do. Because our culture says, if you're going to be happy, you have to sin. And sin never brings happiness, but that's what our culture tells people. But in fact, it's going to take a long time for those wounds that they do to heal. So same thing when a person responds to a religious vocation, can take time to heal those wounds so that they're ready to be able to make a gift of themselves.
And there are obstacles even at the family level, are there not, many times?
It's certainly true that a lot of times families don't understand. It's always been the case, I suppose, in some way. Jesus said, that many times he would separate mother from daughter and father from son, and that, you had to follow him even above our parents, and that is still certainly true today. And a lot of it, I think, is sometimes just misunderstandings, The people whose children are, in their 20s today grew up in a church where they might think, well, I don't know that priests are happy, or I don't want them to be lonely, or they wouldn't understand that most people who live a vocation are extremely happy and extremely fulfilled. And so parents worry sometimes for false reasons.
And the family is so important. How do you advise families? What would you say to families to encourage them or to give them some practical advice on how to foster vocations if their son or daughter is called?
Well, the main thing, of course, is the family needs to become a school of prayer where the children learn how to pray. So that happens by the family praying together. It also happens by the witness of the parents being people of prayer. And I know, for example, there's a family in my archdiocese where 2 priests came from this family. And if you ask those young men what it was, it says, well, our father would take us to daily mass every day. And it was a big deal when you got to be old enough, you could go to daily mass with your dad, And he was a doctor, but he went to daily mass. And that they grew up knowing God was real and that he was honored in their family because of the witness of the father. And then the family praying together basically encourages an environment where the kids can experience the supernatural. Of course, parents have to be cautious today. There's a lot of things that can infiltrate the family home that parents have to be cautious to protect their children from. But mainly, if they teach their children to pray, the children themselves will be able to protect them.
So it really emphasizes the role of the domestic church in helping to provide for and support the universal church.
Yeah, the key to everything is good families. The key to vocations, the key to a strong culture, the key to good leaders is good families, because it's in the family that we learn really how to love, how to give ourselves, who is God, all those things that we need to know.
Bishop Andrew Cozzens of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Your Excellency, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to wrap it up for this portion of our broadcast from the 74th Annual Serra International Convention in St. Louis. I'm Jim Deacon. We'll have more later.